Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once ruled nearly all of Europe. Brilliant strategist, fearless leader, the guy armies feared just by name alone. And yet, his empire came crashing down at Waterloo. Not because he suddenly forgot how to command. Not because his soldiers weren't loyal. No. The truth is way stranger. The empire he built over decades was destroyed by something so simple, so unexpected, that most history books brush right past it. And here's the kicker. Once you hear what it was, you'll never look at Napoleon's defeat the same way again. So let's break it down. The secret weapon that destroyed Napoleon's empire. The Battle of Waterloo wasn't just another clash of armies. It was the final act of Napoleon's career, the climax of 2 decades of war that had set Europe on fire. Historians call it one of the most studied battles in history, and for good reason. Every decision, every charge, every mistake has been analyzed endlessly, because what happened on that muddy June day in 1815 didn't just decide the fate of one man, it reshaped the entire continent. And in this video, we're going to unpack it step by step. First, we'll set the stage, who Napoleon was at this moment, why his return from exile terrified the kings and emperors of Europe, and what was at stake. Then we'll dive right into the battlefield itself, following Napoleon, Wellington, and Blücher move by move. But most importantly, we'll uncover the secret weapon, the hidden factor that no army could control, yet it changed everything. And finally, we'll look at what this meant for Napoleon, for Europe, and for history itself. By the end, you'll see Waterloo in a way most people never have, not just as a battle, but as a turning point powered by something nobody expected. To really understand Waterloo, we've got to rewind just a little bit. Picture this. It's 1815. Napoleon has already been defeated once. After years of dominating Europe, he was forced to abdicate, and the Allied powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, all thought they were finally rid of him. They packed him off to the island of Elba, a tiny speck in the Mediterranean. But here's the thing about Napoleon. He wasn't the type to sit quietly in retirement. After less than a year, he escaped. He sailed back to France, and as soon as he set foot on shore, soldiers who had once been sent to arrest him ended up joining him instead. Within days, his march to Paris became a triumphant parade. And in what historians call the 100 Days, Napoleon was back on the throne, rebuilding his empire like he'd never left. Now, you can imagine the shockwaves this sent through Europe. Kings, emperors, and generals who thought they'd finally buried Napoleon's ambition suddenly had to deal with him all over again. And here's the scary part. His army wasn't just loyal, it was passionate. Many of his soldiers believed they were marching with destiny itself. So the coalition powers scrambled. Britain, under the Duke of Wellington, rallied troops in Belgium. Prussia, led by Field Marshal Blücher, rushed to mobilize. Austria and Russia promised reinforcements, but they were still far away. Time was everything. Napoleon knew his only chance was to strike fast, crush Wellington and Blücher before they could fully unite, and force Europe to negotiate peace with him back on top. That's where Waterloo comes in, not as some random battlefield, but as the showdown that would decide whether Napoleon's comeback would stand, or if it would end, once and for all. June 18, 1815. Dawn breaks over the fields of Waterloo, just south of Brussels. The air is heavy, the ground soaked from a night of relentless rain. What should have been firm farmland is now a mud pit, sucking at boots and wheels. Napoleon stands with his army, nearly 70,000 men, veterans of campaigns that had once shaken Europe. Across the ridge, waiting for him, is the Duke of Wellington, commanding a mixed force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, about 68,000 strong. Both sides know this is it. Whoever wins today decides the fate of Europe. Napoleon's plan seems simple. Hit hard, break Wellington's defenses, and finish him before the Prussians under Blücher can arrive. Normally, Napoleon's artillery, his cannons, would be the key. They'd pound enemy lines, soften them up, then his infantry and cavalry would sweep through. But on this morning he hesitates. The ground is too wet, Cannonballs don't bounce and rip through lines when they're firing into mud. They just sink. Napoleon waits, hoping the ground will dry. By late morning, he finally gives the order. French cannons thunder, smoke billows across the field, and waves of infantry push forward. Villages like Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint become brutal strongpoints, where soldiers fight house to house. French columns crash against British defenses, and for a while it looks like Wellington is just barely hanging on. His troops are battered, stretched thin, but somehow holding the line. Then comes the French cavalry. Thousands of horsemen charge uphill, gleaming sabers raised, hoofs pounding like thunder. They smash into Wellington's squares, tight formations of infantry bristling with bayonets. Normally, sheer momentum could break these lines. But the mud slows them, horses slip, and instead of shattering the British, the French find themselves bogged down in chaos. Napoleon presses again and again, his men fighting furiously, and still Wellington refuses to break. The battle rages, smoke choking the air, the roar of muskets and cannons never stopping. For hours it seems balanced on a knife's edge. But the clock is ticking, and Napoleon knows the longer this drags on, the closer the Prussians come to changing everything. Here's the part that blows people's minds. Napoleon didn't lose Waterloo because of poor tactics, or because Wellington outsmarted him. The truth is, his deadliest enemy that day wasn't even human. It was the rain. The night before the battle, a massive storm rolled across the fields of Belgium. Hours of pounding rain turned the farmland into a swamp. That's why Napoleon delayed his opening attack until late morning. He was waiting for the ground to dry. But that hesitation cost him precious hours. Hours that gave Blücher's Prussian army time to march closer. And when he finally did open fire, his most reliable weapon, his artillery, was crippled. Normally, French cannonballs would bounce across dry earth, skipping through enemy lines and tearing men apart like bowling balls smashing pins. But in the mud, they just landed with a dull thud and stuck. The French gunners worked furiously, but their deadliest advantage was basically neutralized by the ground beneath their feet. It didn't stop there. The mud dragged at the horses, too. Cavalry charges that should have smashed through British lines slowed to a slog. Riders slipped, formations broke, and instead of cutting through, they became easy targets. Imagine trying to sprint across a swamp while the other side just waits for you. That's what Napoleon's elite cavalry faced. So while muskets cracked and cannons roared, the real killer wasn't steel or powder. It was nature itself. The storm had done what no army could. It leveled the playing field, stripping Napoleon of the very tools he relied on to dominate Europe. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a nightmare. Smoke choked the air, the ground was littered with bodies, and both armies were stretched to their limits. Napoleon had thrown everything he could at Wellington, infantry, artillery, wave after wave of cavalry. And yet, the British-led lines still held. Battered, bleeding, but unbroken. Then came the sound that sealed Napoleon's fate. Drums, horns, and the rumble of thousands of boots. From the east, the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher finally arrived. Tens of thousands of fresh troops stormed onto the field, crashing into the French right flank. For Napoleon, it was the one thing he feared most, fighting Wellington head-on while Blücher hammered him from the side. The French tried desperately to hold them off. Units were peeled away from the main fight to stall the Prussian advance, but it was too little, too late. The rain and mud that morning had bought Wellington just enough time for Blücher to arrive. And once he did, the balance was broken. Still, Napoleon refused to give in. In one last gamble, he sent in his Imperial Guard, his most elite, battle-hardened soldiers, the men who had never known defeat. They marched forward, straight at Wellington's center. Their very presence meant to break the enemy's will. But this time it didn't work. The British held their ground, poured musket fire into the Guard, and for the first time in history, the Guard broke. They turned and fled. And in that moment, the myth of Napoleon's invincibility shattered. The French army collapsed in chaos, fleeing the field, while Wellington and Blücher pressed the attack. The great emperor of Europe had been crushed, not just by two armies, but by the storm that gave them the chance to unite. By nightfall, it was over. The once mighty French army was in full retreat, broken and scattered across the countryside. Napoleon himself tried to rally his men, but the spell was broken. The emperor who had once marched across Europe undefeated now faced the impossible: defeat at the hands of mud, rain, and timing. Within days, the news spread across Europe like wildfire. Napoleon, realizing the game was up, abdicated for the second time. This time there would be no mercy. The Allies sent him far away, not to a cozy Mediterranean island, but to a lonely rock in the Atlantic, St. Helena. There, cut off from the world, he would spend the last years of his life reflecting on what could have been. For Europe, Waterloo was more than just another battle. It was the end of an era. The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged for over 20 years, were finished. The Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe, and the balance of power shifted toward stability, at least for a time. And all of it turned on that one storm. A night of rain that turned the battlefield into a swamp, slowed Napoleon's assault, and gave his enemies the chance to unite. The man who had outmaneuvered kings and crushed armies had finally been undone by the weather. So now, Napoleon's empire didn't collapse because of betrayal or brute force, but because of something far simpler: the weather. A storm that changed history forever. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden side of Waterloo, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories, and drop a comment below. What other battles or mysteries should we explore next? And if you thought this was wild, wait until you hear how an even deadlier force, a brutal winter, destroyed an invasion that no army could stop. That story is coming up next, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.